So, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Law in America Society and the Criminal Justice Society, thank you so much for joining our event today on the prison industrial complex. We're honored to have with us on our panel today Professor Nicola Lacey and Professor Johann Koehler from the LSE. So the way the event today will be structured is that we will start off with some speaker introductions and a general overview of the topic. This will then be followed by a chaired panel discussion, at the end of which we will open up the panel to questions from the audience. But if you do have any questions that come to mind during the course of the panel discussion, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and it will be asked to the speakers during the Q&A session. So to begin with, may I kindly ask our speakers today to introduce yourself, your area of expertise, as well as what the concepts of mass incarceration and prison industrial complex means to you from your research. So Professor Lacey, maybe you could get us started to avoid the confusion.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always nice to have a chance to talk sort of outside the classroom about these important issues. So let me just start by introducing myself. I'm Nicola Lacey, generally known as Nikki. I am based in the law department, although I have strong links to social policy through the Mannheim Centre and also the Gender Institute. And I've worked on all sorts of things because I have a low boredom threshold, but the thing I'm actually qualified to do is criminal law and criminal justice. So I teach those, and I teach criminology as well. And in particular, which I imagine is probably why you invited me today, I have done some work on a genre of scholarship which is known as the comparative political economy of crime and punishment. And as part of that work, I have been particularly interested in the United States for the obvious reason that is the sort of subject of your session today. So I wrote a little book in 2008 called The Prisoner's Dilemma, which sets out a sort of typology of different kinds of criminal justice system and tries to begin to answer the question of why different countries have reacted so very differently to similar trends, very broadly speaking, in crime. So most countries, as you probably know, saw crime. My little book, The Prisoner's Dilemma, tries to answer the question, why do some countries punish more harshly, even holding their crime problems more or less constant? So most countries saw an increase in crime in the 70s and 80s, and then most countries saw a decrease in crime for a while from the mid-90s, but they all reacted very differently in terms of punishment. And I tried to come up with a sort of explanation about that, which draws on a political science argument about different varieties of capitalism, and which distinguishes between two families of capitalist system, one of which are highly coordinated, rather long-term, consensus-oriented countries, and the other of which are more like this country and America, very competitive, individualistic, flexibilized labor markets. And I gave some reasons for thinking that the latter would be more likely to be punitive in their responses to crime than the former, where there is a greater investment in workers and a greater interest, therefore, in rehabilitating and reintegrating them. That's a very crude summary, but I highlight that book because it explains why I'm so interested in America, because here's a very big problem with my argument, is that actually America, in terms of its patterns of punishment, is more different from the other Anglo-Saxon, individualistic, liberal market countries like this one than we are, say, from Germany or even from Sweden and Norway, which are paradigms of highly consensus-oriented and coordinated systems. So I became very interested in America, and I've done quite a lot of work on so-called American exceptionalism in crime and punishment with David Soskis, with David Hope, and with Zelia Gallo. So let me then just say something about the mass imprisonment and the prison industrial complex. Now, you've actually got rather a good definition of the prison industrial complex in one of your questions later for Johann, where you talk about, I think, it's a complex idea that suggests the existence of a network of people and parties with vested interests in mass incarceration. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. Corporations, businesses, even local communities can have an interest in the prison complex, because it creates jobs and it creates, a demand for services and goods and that sort of thing. So that is a very broad way of understanding it. I think there's one other thing, though, to say about the concept of the prison industrial complex in the history of the discipline, and that is that it's also somewhat evokes a certain tradition, which is a Marxian tradition. I would pick out, for example, a very famous book which was reissued just a couple of years ago, but originally published in the 70s by Dario Melossi and Massimo Pavarini, two Italian criminologists, which was called The Prison and the Factory. And the idea being that prisons occupy a sort of role in capitalist economies, which is disciplinary and which has much in common with the forms of industrial capitalism, where workers are made docile, to put it in Foucault's terms, through a highly structured workplace. And when there is a surplus of labor in Marxian criminology, you would expect the penal system to be more punitive, to be more pulling people in. But if you want workers to be able to go back into the industrial economy, then prisons, by definition, should be places a little bit like factories, where habits of industry and so on are inculcated. So I think there's quite a lot going on with that concept. One final word on mass imprisonment. It's often used in relation to the United States for the simple reason that for some years, until just relatively recently, the United States had the highest imprisonment rate per 100,000 of the population of any developed country. It isn't quite true, I think, anymore, but it was for a long time. And I think there's just one thing, though, to say about, so mass imprisonment evokes the world in which, for example, certain categories of people, like young Black men, are more likely to go to prison than they are to get married or to serve in the military, very sort of standard life experiences for young men in the States at the time mass imprisonment got going. There's one way, I think, in which the term mass imprisonment is a bit unhelpful, or is a bit misleading, because it makes it sound, it just evokes the scale. But what it doesn't evoke is either the intensity of American imprisonment or the way in which it's targeted against certain groups. So really, it's massively, as we're going to discuss, I'm sure, racially, it's gender targeted. It's basically, we're talking about young men or else older men who get very long sentences because they've committed a relatively serious offence or are repeat offenders. And of course, it's also class and socioeconomically differentiated. So when we say mass, we have to understand that, broadly speaking, people like us would not be at great risk of imprisonment in the United States, but a lot of people are. So I'll stop there and hand over to Johann.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thank you so much to the hosts for sharing this platform with us, and for giving Nikki and me an opportunity to, at a personal level, share our enthusiasm for something, but at a more institutional level, I think the mere fact that this student society began just this year is itself a data point that feeds into the themes that I think that are very much relevant to the conversation yet to follow, about the extent to which criminal justice is now just at the fore of the public discourse and the collective conscience in a way that even recently was not the case. Let me just introduce myself. My name's Johann Koehler. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Social Policy here at the LSE. I study how it comes to be that we think about what kinds of criminal justice policies make sense in our reform conversations. Why is it the case that certain kinds of ways of thinking about wrongdoing, about redress, about forgiveness, about shame, mercy, stigma, power, all of that stuff, Why is it the case that we think about wrongdoing and redress in the terms that we currently think about them? And for a really long time, the going vocabulary, the vocabulary in which people spoke about policy reform in criminal justice was analogized neatly to other domains of social policy. And it was the language of what's called evidence-based policy reform. There's, and by the analogies that I'm referring to are analogies in nursing, education, farming, taxation, migration, development. You pick a domain of policy intervention, and there's an evidence-based variation, interpretation of it. What evidence-based policy refers to, at least in the domain of criminal justice, which is my specialty, is the principle that we have a machine where we can refine that machine by extending the metaphor, by taking cogs, replacing them with better cogs, in the hope that for any given input, we're going to get a better output. At a certain point in my career, I started, I was contributing to an evidence-based criminological agenda for trying to figure out how might we come up with a safer, more effective, more humane, and dare I even say cheaper approach to criminal justice. But at a certain point, I started wondering whether or not the machine itself is a machine that is itself fit for purpose. And so that's what brings me to studying the thinkable. What is the repertoire of thinkable policy options in criminal justice policy? And so evidence-based criminal justice policy became interesting to me insofar as the extent to which it is taken for granted as the way you're supposed to think about criminal justice policy was taken for granted, so to speak. What makes being a criminologist so exciting at the moment is that, and I wonder whether Nikki might corroborate this, is as recently as my arrival at the LSE, which was back in 2019, something that I do at the beginning of every term is I'll ask my students, what are some of the hot button things that you want to make sure that we cover over the course of this term? And the things that would come up were all, I mean, there were some recurrent themes. We want to talk about minority overrepresentation in the justice system. We want to talk about private prisons. We want to talk about discretion. We want to talk about selective enforcement. Had you said in 2019 that within 4 years, the same question will be met by, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, a majority of students in one's classes replying, I would like to talk about the conversations about abolishing institutions of criminal justice. Had you said 4 years ago that that was going to be as salient in the public conscience as it now is, I would have, I can tell you, at least from my own perspective, I would have scoffed. And so by way of kind of introducing what it is that I do, as studying what the boundaries of what qualifies as a thinkable policy option, something that's so exciting about being a criminologist at the moment is that the boundaries of thinkability move very abruptly when we talk about criminal justice, at least at the moment. Okay, so Nikki's already covered a lot about what is about getting us on the same page about mass imprisonment and the prison industrial complex. Let me add only not very much here, but mass imprisonment. So in broadest brushstrokes, we're talking about something that a phenomenon that is unprecedented. It's a bundle of policies that is unprecedented across 2 different dimensions. Nikki was emphasizing the comparative sense in which it's unprecedented. The imprisonment rate in America is hovering somewhere around 500 per 100,000. Maybe it's up to 550. I should know that off the top of my head, but regardless, it's close to about 3 times or more the imprisonment rate in England and Wales. If you go to just another G8 country like Japan, it's 15 times as much, or 12 times as much, excuse me. So it's unprecedented if you look at other countries. Another dimension in which it's unprecedented, however, is chronological. And for this, you can, let's just imagine a chart that takes us from 1930 to about 1970. And within the United States, the imprisonment rate hovered pretty stably at about 110 per 100,000. Standard deviation was about 9. It was pretty constant. And it led, I mean, very famously, to very established criminologists in the early 1970s to theorize that punishment rates tend to be pretty stable on the whole. Not long thereafter, things changed, and in the 40 years that followed, it climbed about 5-fold, the rate of imprisonment. So that's the broad brushstroke version, is that mass imprisonment refers to a bundle of policies that are unprecedented, both comparatively and chronologically. The slightly more fine-grained brushstroke version is that I think there are about 6 or 7 properties worth taking into account. The first is the sense in which we're talking about something big. That's what the mass is signaling. We're talking about something, a 5-fold increase. The second is that we're talking about something abrupt, that this happened in the compressed time frame of a single generation, give or take. The third and fourth properties of mass incarceration are pretty closely linked. It's both dispersed and specific. Dispersed in the sense that it's the same phenomenon that gripped 51 different penal systems, the 50 different states and the federal penal system. So these, the climb across each of these jurisdictions followed normal distribution, which generally tells you that it's the same underlying force propelling change across all of them. Now, if there's variation, that's the nature of a normal distribution. There are some states imprisoned with less velocity than others, but we're talking about something having gripped an entire country for over a generation and doing something similar. Namely, for any given penal question, the answer became send them to prison. Okay. That's the sense in which it was a dispersed phenomenon. It was common. The sense in which it was specific is the one that Nikki was referring to, that we're talking about how a phenomenon that for most of us was invisible. Really compelling analysis that came out of, I think it's 2008, by Bruce Weston of the National Longitudinal Survey, showed that by the early 2000s, the chance of a young Black man who hadn't graduated high school, having experienced prison at some point in their lives, was 1 in 3. When you've got a concentration of state intervention in a slice of the population that narrow, so intense, you have the ingredients for what one observer has called the prison has become a social reordering institution. Okay. That's 3 and 4, that it's dispersed and specific. Number 5, it's resilient. In the sense that mass incarceration was impervious to political shifts. If you think that mass incarceration was a left-wing initiative as opposed to a right-wing initiative, you're mistaken. It was both, irrespective of whether it was whether you had left-wing or right-wing political leaders. The chart of mass incarceration just kept going up. 6, there's something incongruous about mass incarceration, by which I mean it's not connected to crime rates. If you think that this was about whether or not you could, about the fear of rising crime, maybe that there's an open argument that this was indirectly linked to crime rates, but it was not directly linked to crime rates. Final thing, just because I'm a social policy professor, it's really costly. Mass incarceration costs a heck of a lot. And I spent many of my years in living in California, a state I adore. In the 1970s, the state investment in its correctional system was accounted for about 2% of the state's budget. At the time, that was about $200 million. By the 2010s, it accounted for 6% of the state's budget. That might not sound like a lot, but by that point, we're talking about more than $10 billion. That's not just a huge quantitative increase in the investment in the correctional system. It's also, it also signifies a huge redistribution of priorities, because at the same time, the amount of investment in the state's educational system had gone from about $500 million a year up to only a little over $3 billion. So there had been a switch in priorities. It was more important to cage than to school. Okay. That's mass imprisonment. Not much to say about prison industrial complex yet, except that it originates as a term in the, I think in the late 90s. My understanding is that it's attributed to a prominent penal abolitionist by the name of Angela Davis, who, as I understand it, coins the term prison industrial complex in the context of an exercise in reasoning by analogy. Bear in mind that by the late 1980s, people had become really worried about the extent to which the military had become this bottomless pit into which people were the state had been throwing money. Now, Angela Davis, I think in a very rhetorically deft maneuver, reasoned by analogy that just as the military industrial complex had become a device to understand the untrammeled and unconstrained investment in this black hole we're calling the military, so too we should be concerned about a thicket of interests that make invisible huge wasteful spending on caging our neighbors. Now, what Davis, I'm going to be unfair to Angela Davis for a second. She gets something really right, and she gets something, well, I was going to say wrong. Not so much wrong as not quite right. She gets right that there is, that mass incarceration is the product of a dense thicket of very different interests that point in different directions, except insofar as they all point in the direction of increasing prison. But they are arrayed in very different places with very different institutional aspirations. And if we're going to have a serious conversation about reform, about dampening, or maybe even one day, hopefully, unraveling mass incarceration, we have to take seriously the different directions in which those institutions point. That's the thing she gets right. The thing she gets not quite right is that there is an emphasis, a real kind of a focus on private interests that has, I think, misled us into a critique of mass incarceration that has put, I think, frankly, just too much emphasis on the private prison industry. That's not to say that that's something we don't need to worry about. There are plenty of reasons why one might worry about the rise of private prisons, not least of which the kind of the distortion into private interests that inmates are seen as, people are seen as commodities out of which an institution can extract a better bottom line. What does that mean materially? Just to speak at a policy level, it means that in an environment where sentence lengths have increased and the prison population has aged and elderly prison inmates tend to be more expensive, private prisons prefer to cage younger inmates, leaving the expensive inmates to the public sector. That's a really worrisome thing. But private prisons account for, at most, I think it's something like 8% of the entire mass incarceration pie. You could remove all of them. You'd still have a mass incarceration problem that far eclipses its comparator countries, even just those that spring immediately to mind. It occurs to me I've been going on for a while, so I'll shut up. But thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Lacey and Professor Koehler. That was a very thorough and clear introduction to the topic we have today. I hope we can really flesh some of that out to our questions. So our first question happens to be for Dr. Koehler because it's a very theoretical question. So given your broad academic exposure and your experience in the fields of criminology as well as social policy, what are the broad themes in these two fields that underlie any conversation that we may have about punishment and control? Because those are the key themes that are underlying the question of incarceration.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that question. It's a lovely question. So criminology is not often housed in a social policy department. I really love that at the LSE it is housed in a social policy department. I love that the LSE has, for a bunch of historical accidents, dispersed criminology across a lot of different departments. I think criminology is much the richer for it. One of the things that I really like about practicing criminology in a social policy department is that the connections between other domains of social policy are that much clearer in view. They're much more in focus. I think I alluded to them earlier when I was describing the kind of the parallels between evidence-based this, that, and the other thing. The way a social policy professor thinks about social policy is, I mean, historically, is in the language of what the state provides and what the state withholds. Now, criminologists have done a lot of work in the last 30, 40 years to try and complicate that binary, that one of the things that makes punishment so darn thorny to study is that punishment is fundamentally in the business of administering grief, that someone somewhere suffers harm and we try and figure out how to deal with it. Given the ethical and normative kind of complexity of administering, of the state administering over grief, it gets a little hard to figure out whether or not what the state is doing is there to help people or is there to hurt people. In the judicious application of hurt is one interpretation of punishment. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the historic interpretation of social policy is the study of this, what the state provides and what the state withholds. When you talk about punishment, it's hard to figure out whether or not that binary holds up. But what the state provides and what the state withholds is oftentimes the same thing. This has given rise to a whole agenda of criminological research called penal welfarism. The underlying ideas of penal welfarism is that we could imagine even something unpleasant like punishment as there to help. Indeed, for decades, when rehabilitation was the in thing, was the fashionable way of going about punishment, the criminological zeitgeist was one that said, when we punish, we shouldn't worry too much about being disproportionate, precisely because we're helping. And so the big themes in the way social policy and criminology think about punishment and control has walked back this original binary that in the context of punishment is not that helpful between the state providing stuff and the state withholding stuff. And most recently, I'll just share this thought by way of closing as an answer to this. That really generative theoretical provocation that comes out of all of the research called penal welfarism, the penal welfarism literature, has given rise in most recent years to conversations about policy reform that bring us full circle to where I began earlier. Namely, that people are talking, people in social policy and people in criminal justice studies, people in criminology, are talking about criminal justice in a way that I haven't seen in earlier years, namely that they're talking about first principles of what kind of criminal justice might we want after we've first had a conversation about how do we want to relate to one another. Once we have some kind of agreement about how we want to relate to one another, the conversations that I've seen in social policy and criminology are conversations about what might the institutions look like that best reflect those first order principles. And so note the distinction between that sequence. First, we have a conversation about how we want to relate to one another, then design criminal justice to reflect those arrangements. Note how different that is than the evidence-based criminal justice conversation, that instead takes the machine you've got as given and tries to refine it.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting take on theoretical basis of our discussion today. So our next question is for Professor Lacey, and it's basically around your work and how it examines the institutional structure of the political system that has shaped American exceptionalism in crime and punishment. And so can you really elaborate on that perspective and what you found out through your research?
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. But before I do that, can I be naughty and just go back to what Johann was saying? And first of all, he hoped I would corroborate the idea that we're in a very interesting moment at the moment where abolitionism, which has a very long and distinguished tradition in Europe, but was sort of nowhere other than with Angela Davis, honestly, in the United States, has had a huge revival. And I don't know, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question why that is, whether I'm sure that the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement is part of it. And I don't know how many of you have seen this book by an American philosopher called Tommy Shelby, The Idea of Prison Abolition. Even people like Shelby, who ultimately come out against abolition, are taking the idea seriously and feeling that we should be engaging with it. There's also a really big emerging literature on reconceiving punishment in terms of forgiveness, which I've been contributing to in a small way, and there are lots and lots, there's a lot going on there. So I think Johann's absolutely right. This is a very exciting and interesting and significant moment. One other just supplementary thing on mass imprisonment, just you mentioned, Johann, that the Bruce Weston's work. And from that same study, and another important point about mass imprisonment, I think, is that it doesn't just affect those who are imprisoned. Particularly given the social concentration, it has incredibly important effects on families. You know, really significant proportion of children in America within a certain demographic are growing up not only without a father present, but probably not even knowing their father. I was at an event at LSE last night in which an American academic from the Brookings Institution cited the most extraordinary figure that of American children whose parents separate, something like 30% never see their father again. Extraordinary figure. And I bet mass imprisonment has something to do with that. But perhaps less obviously, what Weston found was that it made a huge impact on the capacity of communities. You know, if you have a community where a very high proportion are single parent households with the trauma and expense of perhaps of visiting the imprisoned family member, often a very long way away from where they live. That's a sort of lack of capacity in terms of all the very small things that people do in communities by way of social and political participation. And I think Western did us all a great service in charting that sort of impact. So to come on to your really excellent question, and I echo as well everything Johann has said about how great it is that you've run this event, and thank you so much for including us, because we're academics and we love talking about our work, because of course we get very excited about it. So I've been working quite a lot on, as you say, the institutional structure of the political system, and I want to just sort of set this in context by saying you all probably thinking, oh, what's so special about that? Because you studied criminal justice, and you'll know that there are a million articles and books that are called things like the politics of criminal justice, the politics of punishment, the politics of law and order, and that's true. But when I sort of started thinking about this field comparatively, I as it happens, and you know, academic work always has a personal serendipitous story behind it. I'm married to a political scientist, and at a certain point in my career, I used to go to seminars where he and his colleagues were discussing their varieties of capitalism paradigm, and I used to sit there and think, why aren't political scientists interested in punishment? Because short of going to war, it's the biggest form of power that the state has, and yet criminologists weren't terribly interested in political science. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it's really true, isn't it, Johann? And political scientists weren't all that interested in crime and punishment. That has changed a bit in the last 20 years, but when I started working in this field, it was still true. Now, we all know, obviously, that the proximate cause of levels of punishment and the quality of punishment are things like sentencing systems, judicial systems, how parole systems work, etc., etc. We know those are the proximate causes. But all the laws and policies that really shape and form those proximate causes are products of the political system. And that's just sort of super obvious, isn't it? So given that we have a whole slate of scholarship in political science that purports to be explaining to us how political systems work affects their capacity to deliver good social and formulate and deliver good social policy, it seemed odd to me that no one had really been looking at things like, well, how does the electoral system affect criminal justice policy? How does the party system affect criminal justice policy? How does, who gets to vote affect criminal justice policy? And that's the kind of thing that I've been working on in relation to America. So what's so special about America as a political system would be your next question. So what's really extraordinary about the American political system? We all know that it's a federal system, but it's much more than that. It's a radically localized system. So you have a federal criminal justice system, you have, more importantly, state criminal justice systems, but you also have a huge number of elected offices at the local level. District attorneys would be the obvious one, but many police chiefs are also elected, and if they're not elected, they are appointed by people who are political electees. School boards, county commissioners, you name it, there are masses and masses of roles that are either criminal justice roles or have an impact on criminal justice, which are being elected at the local level in America, where we wouldn't have any elections here. We've moved a little bit in that direction with police and crime commissioners here, but it's tiny compared with America. I don't know how many of you ever spent time in America, but at election time in America, you can usually hardly walk around local communities because the practice in the States is to put candidates adverts sort of on stakes into the ground. You'll be tripping over all these stakes and you know, so-and-so for district attorney. Now, that sounds great, doesn't it? It's a hyper-democratic system, highly accountable. Everybody gets to have a say, you know, local communities can have a say, etc. But in the context of the sort of political climate and the rising crime in America, which I do think is actually part of the picture, although it's part of the picture in a complex way, as Johann has said. The problem with this hyper-democratic system is, particularly in what we call a sort of competitive first past the post type system, not like the continental system where you have proportional representation and parties have to sort of bargain out a compromise platform, really, if they're going to have any kind of stable government. In our system and in the American system, it's, you know, whoever gets the most votes wins, basically. So the big game for politicians is to decide how to get most votes. And roughly speaking, in the American political and social context, since certainly the early 70s, one good way of getting votes is to promise to be tough on crime. So if you're a DA, you're a candidate for the office of district attorney, a good strategy is to promise that you're going to be very tough on crime, you're going to prosecute everyone, you're going to go for maximum sentences and so on. And once that starts to be regarded as a vote winner, it's a bit like an arms race. It's very hard for the other party to get off the wagon because there isn't a very strong party system in America which can mediate that. And in fact, most of these local elections don't have any strong party affiliation at all. Now, there are two further bits of this jigsaw that I want to just lay out for you. They're very simple and they're all about basic sort of incentives, really. You might still come back to me and say, but still, it must be a good thing that local people can get stuck in. And if they, you know, they think there's too much imprisonment and it's too expensive, well, they can vote that way. Well, here are two further problems, I think, with this system, or reasons why this system has led to this sort of perfect storm in terms of increasing imprisonment, because Johann is absolutely right to say this is a temporal exception and not just a spatial exception in America. America has always been significantly more punitive than this country, but it was stably so until certainly the 1950s, and things start to really change in the 1960s. So why has that happened? Well, one of the things is that perhaps counterintuitively, if you look at the demographic of local elections, who actually goes out and vote, strangely enough, they're on the whole a more privileged, a richer demographic than those who vote at state and federal levels. Now, there are lots and lots of complicated reasons for this, but it means, roughly speaking, that if you live in a nice area, you're going to vote for all the things that you care about to stay in that area. And that will be, you know, decent but not over policing, good schools. That's probably going to bring with it high property prices and so on. You get a sort of equilibrium. People will turn out to vote to protect what is good in their area. And in poorer areas, unfortunately, there is a much lower turnout. So first of all, you've got the fact that the people who are voting in local elections probably on the whole are less bothered about unjust policing or, you know, the impact of mass imprisonment, because it's very unlikely to affect them or their children. The second thing is, you might think, well, lots of democracy is good because it means lots of accountability. But if you're a district attorney running on a law and order, tough on crime platform, there is no point in your political career at which you are going to be held accountable for the costs of that policy. It's a very expensive policy, as Johann's pointed out, but the costs register at the state level. Maybe a little bit at the city level, but mainly at the state level. So there is absolutely nothing to disincentivize you as a DA from standing on a punitive ticket. And that, I think, I mean, a recent work by a very, very good scholar called John Pfaff, who's a specialist on prosecutors, district attorneys, and so on, and particularly the state ones, has argued recently that the single biggest thing you could do to help row back a bit on mass incarceration would be to stop electing prosecutors. And this is a sort of incredible irony, because actually the election of prosecutors was brought in specifically to try to depoliticize the system, but it unfortunately, and in the conditions prevailing over the last half century or so, it's done exactly the reverse. So that's just to really give you a little flavour of why the way the American political system works might make a sort of discrete difference to the way the penal system works.
Thank you so much, Professor Lacey. That's a very clarifying picture. And following from that is our next question for Professor Koehler. So she's talked about the whole political institutional structure underlying the current problem in the US. So I was wondering, maybe elaborating on that and zooming out a little, the prison industrial complex as a more broader idea suggests, as we initially talked about, the existence of a network of people and parties that have a certain vested interest in mass incarceration. So what, in your opinion, are exactly these interests, and why have these interests and their influences been particularly strong in the US?
Yeah, yet another wonderful question. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So first, let me just call back to, for want of a better way of putting this, the indeterminacy of those interests. That mass incarceration, as a conceit, like it's helpful, but it's simplifying something. That we're using one term to describe innumerable different things happening at once. And it's just important to kind of disentangle that for the purposes of recognizing that you've got, although the outcome is incontrovertibly a bad thing, and it's undeniable in its scale, it deceives the eye into thinking that everyone wanted this. There's actually, I mean, let me exaggerate for a moment. I really have to bold italics underscore that I'm exaggerating for effect here, but one might make an argument that no one actually chose mass incarceration. That the reason I'm kind of issuing some caution that I am exaggerating here is that a lot of people chose a lot of different things. Some of those people might have been reasonably asked to anticipate that mass incarceration was a foreseeable consequence of some of those things. But it would be wrong to say that America chose mass incarceration. And so, and I think that kind of, that indeterminacy, that we've got a bunch of different actors arrayed in a lot of different kinds of offices, each of which has different institutional and organizational aspirations, and yet they all happened to generate a bundle of policies whose aggregated effect was mass incarceration. Helps draw attention to how, when we say vested interests, we could mean a lot of different things, because in what sense were they vested? Well, it's a bit misleading to say that they were vested in mass incarceration as such. So let me make my life a little bit easier and just point at a few different possible candidates for what those vested interests might have been. A good answer, a more complete answer than the one I can give, is going to be able to point to penal appetites within the population, unions, some of which are extremely powerful in advocating for different kinds of penal policies, private interests, lobbying, what have you. A thorough answer would be able to review all of these. Let me just simplify things for myself and just talk about the kind of the ideal typical trichotomy into which criminologists tend to split the criminal justice system, which is policing, courts, and corrections. So first, let's talk about police. Police officers is actually, I think, the least, I mean, I was about to say the least relevant part of what I'm about to discuss here is the vested interests. Relevance is probably it's probably a bit cavalier of me. It's not that they're irrelevant, but as a place where one might think about penal reform of the sort that might walk back mass incarceration, their role is a lot more indirect than the other two that I'm going to discuss. And it's indirect for two reasons. First, as a general matter, extending the lesson that that Nikki was just giving about the mismatched incentives between penal officers, extending it from the lesson she was just giving about prosecutors, it goes even more so, it applies with even more force to police officers. I would be willing to wager that across the, oh gosh, Nikki might have to help me. At last count, how many police departments were there in the US? I think it's 10,000, was it? It's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 police officers, because most of them have between 3 and 6 cops. If you were to take a random sample of, let's say, 100 officers arrayed from across the country, I would be willing to venture that the majority of them would tell you that mass incarceration doesn't actually figure very prominently in the work that they do on a daily basis. It's just not that important. Now, I've just wrapped up a historical project that has dug into the archives of the Chicago Police Department and the New York Police Department from the years from slavery's abolition in the 1860s through to the 1920s. Turns out they used to care a great deal about how well the prisons were working, because they complained all the darn time about having to deal with people who had been, in their view, incompetently released from custodial institutions. But this is still going to reinforce my point. They cared about it because municipal offices, like, for example, the mayor's office, said it's the police department's fault that these people won't learn to behave. The reason this reinforces my point is that for as long as the police departments across America don't understand mass incarceration as their problem to solve, they're not going to be part of the solution. That's the first sense in which their relationship to mass incarceration is indirect. The second sense is that there is actually research coming out that I'm finding pretty convincing about how increased investment in policing is actually likely to yield all sorts of benefits in reducing mass incarceration down the line. That it might actually be a very effective lever to pull if you want to bring down imprisonment rates within the next 5 to 10 years. That's, I mean, jury's still out on that, the research is still coming in, but I'm finding it really, it's interesting. Let me now speak to, I'm still sticking with Athmaja's question about what are the vested interests. Let's turn to the other two parts of the criminal justice system, courts and then corrections. One of them, courts, is going to be important with respect to the quantity of incarceration. The other one, corrections, custodial institutions, that's going to be important with respect to the quality of incarceration. So, quantity. Something that might be hard to wrap one's mind around in a society like England, in a jurisdiction like England and Wales, where plea bargaining isn't as prominent a feature of the way prosecutors do their work, is that in the United States, and I can paint with quite a broad brush in what I'm about to say. Prosecutors tend to imagine severe punishment as a criterion of professional success. Right? This isn't just, I'm not just referring to elected DAs, I'm talking about individual prosecutors. If I secure long sentences, I have done a good job. That's one very important vested interest. And the research that Nikki alluded to a moment ago from John Pfaff really convincingly shows that the biggest change over the last generation or so is that prosecutors have been prosecuting the same behaviors that they in previous years might have prosecuted as misdemeanors, as felonies, where the sentence length is much, much greater. So how do you fix this? Well, the bottom-up approach is going to look something like educating prosecutors about the perils of mass incarceration, get them to care in ways that they haven't about the costs that their prosecution occasions. The top-down approach is going to look something like, to use economic language, getting prosecutors to internalize the externality or the spillover effects that courts generally don't shoulder the costs of sending more people to prison. You could find a way, and it's administratively very complex to imagine how this might look, but if you can find a way to get local jurisdictions which pay for prosecution to internalize the costs of imprisonment, which is a cost ordinarily borne by the state, that's a pretty good indication that you found yourself a top-down solution for bringing down the quantity of incarceration. Last point, the quality of incarceration. Here's the vested interest of corrections. I've got very little to say about this, but there's a principle that a lot of legal scholars have noted, principle called carceral deference, which is the principle that refers to in the few occasions when inmates have been able to file suit saying prison conditions have undermined my right to dignity, my right to Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. In the few occasions when they've been able to get into court, generally speaking, courts defer to the prison institution against prison inmates. There is some indication that that deference to prison officials at the expense of inmates is maybe beginning to erode, at least since a very prominent Californian case called Brown versus Plata about the provision of healthcare in California's prisons. That, if the trend continues to erode carceral deference, I think there are prospects to not necessarily minimize mass incarceration, but at least redress some of the dreadful conditions contained behind bars. Okay. That's my sketch of some of the vested interests.
Thank you so much. You really fleshed out that question and kind of problematized the premise on which we started. So thank you so much for that. And I think our next question is to Professor Lacey. So this is a specific aspect of your work, really. So I think there's a general understanding of mass incarceration in the US having really strong racial underpinnings. But can you provide an insight into your argument that the politics of race is actually an incomplete explanation for the development of US criminal policy? Because I think that's a very interesting take.
So thanks so much for the question. This is obviously a very important question. And let me just preface my answer by saying, I mean, clearly nobody in their right mind would argue anything other than that race is a very important part of the explanation for America's patterns of punishment. But I think there are two reasons to think, and I'm just going to give two very crude, simple reasons, because we're sort of getting a bit of time. It would be nice to have some Q&A time left. But here are two reasons to think it's not the whole story. The first is just a very sort of crude thought experiment. But what does the pattern of American and scale of American imprisonment look like if you simply subtract, let's say, all African Americans from the prison population? Well, it's still about, 4 times as high as this country, maybe 3 times. If you then also take out all Hispanic prisoners, it's still massively greater. So, even without its doubtless highly racialized patterns of punishment, America is very punitive and has become more punitive. So that's first thing to say. But a more important thing, and I think this is something, an argument to which, in my experience, American scholars are tremendously resistant. Unfortunately, this point about the racialization of punishment is not specific to America. So to take a very simple comparison, New Zealand also has a lamentable, sadly, record in terms of racial disproportionality in imprisonment. Unfortunately, in fact, this is true in many jurisdictions. In fact, I can see Pedro's on the call, and he'll remember in our LLM class, we had a sort of brainstorming session in our comparative discussion about whether there was anyone in the room from a jurisdiction where there wasn't a major issue of racial disproportionality. And we had one Chilean colleague who had a very interesting argument as to why this wasn't the major problem in Chile, but almost everyone else said, yes, of course, it's a major issue. New Zealand's disproportionality of indigenous people mainly and people from the sort of surrounding islands near New Zealand are the racial disproportionality is actually significantly worse than in the United States. But that huge race problem in New Zealand's penal practice has not also brought with it this intensity and scale that we call mass imprisonment in America. So there's something, I mean, racial disproportionality, racism, institutional racism in criminal justice systems, I'm afraid is endemic. It's a big problem, and it's something we have to understand and have to have strategies for combating. But I think there's a lot of reason to think there's a lot more going on than just the race thing in America. And that's not to say that race isn't important. I want to just lob in one other really interesting thought, which is how we compare at this. Lisa Miller, who's a very interesting political scientist at Rutgers, made what I think is a fascinating argument in a paper about 3 years ago, in which she says, maybe we shouldn't be talking about American exceptionalism, but the exceptionalism of the Americas. Because she said, if you look at American data on imprisonment and racial disproportionality and so on, actually, the United States looks more like, let's say, Brazil or many other Latin American states, although obviously there's quite a lot of variation within Latin America, than it does to other developed OECD countries. Looks a bit more like South Africa, actually. So is one of the issues here a process of state formation over time in which certain groups never get properly incorporated? Now, obviously in Latin America, that's to do with colonialism and the post-colonial legacy. In South Africa, likewise, plus the legacy of apartheid and so on. But there's a sense in which some groups never get properly incorporated, never get properly included, never get real de facto full membership. And that means that they are vulnerable in various ways. It's a very extraordinary thing in America. So if you think about it, America has, if not a distinguished, a sort of impressive record of absorbing minority groups. When you think about it, it is basically a land of migration. And yet this, both the Hispanic migration and the African Americans still are really disproportionately on the receiving end of this kind of. So whether this these states that don't have a sort of stable way of incorporating everybody are more liable to reach for punitive methods, I think is a really interesting question, but it will take an awful lot of proof. So I think that's probably enough for me to say.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting take. So for our final question today from our side before we open it up to the audience, Professor Koehler, based on your work on evidence-based policy reform in the US, or more your general research, broadly speaking, what kind of reforms, be it in policy or more generally, will help address this current issue of mass incarceration, as well as maybe being ambitious, the racial biases within it?
Athmaja, yet another really great question. I share Nikki's excitement to hear from others in the group. So if it's okay, I'm just going to go lickety split here. I see, rather than specifying particular things, I'll describe three kind of genres of change that I could see making a difference. First is to speak to practical change. If I was to draw together the insights from the criminological insights across policing, courts, and corrections, as though they all speak to a particular policy agenda, one word springs to mind, and the word is triage. Now, triage is the principle of, this is what economists do best. It's the scientific study of the allocation of a scarce resource. We can imagine most social policy as being a kind of triage, but one of the things that's really compelling that's coming out of criminological research across a lot of different contexts and jurisdictions is that when you devote penal power to units of the population that are, frankly, low risk, low priority units, it tends to backfire in really bad ways. Think of it a little bit like cracking a walnut with a sledgehammer, where the sledgehammer here is penal power. It's a big hammer. It's very expensive to wield, and it often backfires, especially when it's applied on, to continue this metaphor, as though people are walnuts, which is not what I think, but when the walnut is not something that really needed all of that force. Don't do that. When you allocate penal power to those units of a population that are posing the greatest worry, that's where you are most likely to be able to administer a cheaper criminal justice, a more effective criminal justice, and arguably, given that it's targeted, a more humane criminal justice as well. So that's the practical version of an answer. The administrative version of an answer is one that you've heard at multiple stages throughout today's conversation, which is that we could imagine different forms of American governance that might curtail, just to pick one example, the spillover effects, where different offices don't actually shoulder the costs of the choices that they make. It would be ambitious to imagine this kind of administrative bureaucratic governance change, but I think it's actually like a totally reasonable thing to devote attention to. And then the last one is, this is the real pie in the sky one. This is the kind of the ideological change. So if the first was practical change, the second was kind of governance change, the third is ideological change. It's just a reconsideration of what it means to do wrong and what it means to forgive. Do we want the prison? Do we, or at least, even if it doesn't have to be the existential question of whether we want the prison or don't we, can we at least have a redistributive conversation about, do we want the prison like this or do we want the prison like that? That seems like the conversation that, very excitingly to me at least, people are actually having. Like, it has become thinkable, in other words, to have conversations about, do we want the prison like this or like that? Okay. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's some really strong points to think about. So we're going to look at questions from the audience. So I have a couple in the chat. I don't think we have much time, so we'll try to go for 2 or 3. And if anyone wants to, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question after I'm done with the ones in the chat. Okay, so the first question is, do the speakers have a take on the fundamental distinction between criminal justice in the global north and the global south?
That's a very, very big question. And one of the other really exciting things, I think, in our field at the moment, I'm sure Johann will corroborate this as well, is that finally we're beginning to get a build up, a sort of critical mass of work on the global south, because one of the big problems in comparative political economy certainly has been that, you know, it's been sort of, most of the models have been based on assumptions about the global north, because that's where the research has been, that's where it's been easier to get the data. This is really, really beginning to change. And actually, I just noticed that a very recent issue of punishments in society has got, so there's a lot now on Latin America, there's quite a bit on Asia, and there's just been a special issue on Africa, which has been, you know, really the last region to really get much. And of course, there are economic reasons for this. There just isn't as much funding for research in poorer parts of the world. Do we know enough to say really what is there a global north, global south split, or is it a democracy, functioning democracy, stability, rich, poor? I think there are too many variables for my mind. The global south, global north is too sort of blunt a comparator to be really, really worth thinking about. I think we need to think about building comparative models that are based as much on data from the global south as from data on the global north, and take it from there.
Yeah. If I can just add one thought to that, if that's okay. This picks up on the puzzle introduced earlier about why don't criminologists think more politically? Historically, people studied and made sense of criminal justice systems in a kind of, for want of a better way of putting this, in quite a parochial way, in the sense that criminal justice systems were intelligible only on their own terms. And something that, and yet another thing that makes being a criminologist these days so exciting during this moment when we're getting so many insights about penalities in the global south, is that I think, at least my own sense, is that the criminological kind of resistance to thinking about criminal justice as even a geopolitical force, that resistance is loosening. People are beginning to understand that penality, a state's relationship to punishment, is actually among the things that bind nation states to one another. I was just lecturing yesterday to my students about how there's a wonderful analysis by Daniel Botsman about how the origins of the prison are themselves origins that he historicizes as a consequence of slavery's abolition in America. Likewise, the origins of crimmigration in India are origins that we can historicize and trace very neatly to slavery's abolition in England. And so what you're seeing now with the growth with the growing appreciation of penality in the global South is beyond just the intrinsic value of being able to understand jurisdictions on their own terms and differences between jurisdictions, is that the criminologists are having a much greater appreciation of how jurisdictions, even jurisdictions that we thought don't really have conversations with one another in ways that think criminologically, are actually very much interdependent. Whole nation states depend on one another in ways that we can intuit in terms of trade, commerce, whatnot. But it turns out that they are dependent on one another in the way that they punish. And that's fascinating. And we should be paying much more attention to it. And now's the time to be doing it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone in the audience have a question that they would like to unmute and ask? If not, I can move on to the question in the chat. Okay. So I think a general question that has been asked is around, I think this is not exactly related to the particular topic, but you have mentioned several times around the growth and arguments around the abolition of policing as well as criminal justice system more generally. And I think it was also talked about with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I was wondering what your take, as people who have been in this field for a really long time, is on this idea of maybe completely abolishing policing systems or criminal justice systems generally.
Shall I start, Johann, or do you want to start?
Please.
So I'm like Johann. I really welcome this debate about abolitionism. I think it's entirely a good thing. But like Tommy Shelby, I'm not going to go for abolition in any real, obvious, robust sense. And here's the problem, and it's a sort of structuring paradox for all of us who work on criminal justice, that the injustices that criminal justice systems typically perpetrate in terms of, the over punishments, that the whole sort of Jeffrey Ryman, the rich get richer, the poor get prison, the racism, all the terrible things about criminal justice that make things worse for those disproportionately caught up in it. But those same groups are also disproportionately on the receiving end of crime. And there is no doubt about the fact that that can be very difficult, and you have to have some sorts of institutions to respond to it. Does that have to be policing and punish and prison as we know it? Definitely not. Definitely not. And that's why thinking, the abolitionist spirit, if you like, which I take it, and Shelby sort of argues, is about just thinking outside the box. It's about not taking for granted what we have. We know that police spend most of their time doing sort of low-grade social work. We don't need police officers doing that. We need to really rethink our institutions. It's very, very difficult. I go back to the political system. The political system is what makes it so difficult. But I think that there is room for really radical rethinking. And as I say, I think even the idea of thinking of punishment in terms of blame in the sort of retributive way is a sort of something that we should try to weaken our addiction to, really, and try to sort of think in terms of criminal justice as being about responding to a set of harmful conducts that cause real social problems, but doing so in a way that is oriented to repairing relationships and not simply censoring and stigmatizing and punishing in that retributive sense.
That was really lovely. Thanks so much for that, Nikki. I don't know how I can follow that. I appreciate that my answer to this, I know at the outset, this is going to sound spineless and cowardly. But the way I think about criminal justice is through the lens of confusion. I have found very meaningful to me. I have put work into trying to preserve, feeling deeply confused, not just about criminal justice as it is, but also about criminal justice as it could be. And the agenda, the research agenda that gets me up in the morning of trying to study what is the repertoire of thinkable policy changes available to us, is where those confusions are most clearly manifest. I contributed very in good faith, very meaningfully, and in ways of which I'm still proud, early in my career, to evidence-based criminal justice policy. I was part of that tradition, and I'm still proud of the contributions I made to it. I have been very generatively, very effectively provoked by the abolitionist groundswell, especially of the last few years. And I find the dislodging from a settled state of what I had always suspected was a quite narrow window of available policy options. I found the dislodging of that narrowness that abolitionism has made possible only good. I have been gripped and grateful for that dislodging, but I remain confused about how to go about setting out a meaningful, productive direction for criminal justice of the future. I don't know. I am not in a position to, I am neither in a position to self-identify as a devout proselytizer for evidence-based criminal justice, nor for penal abolitionism. I'm just not in that position. And to many interlocutors, that is deeply dissatisfying. Johann, you got to pick a side. And I respect why that reply comes in my direction. Not that you've asked, but I'll just share my counter argument, is that cowardly though it may appear, that's actually exactly what being an academic is for, is to find those moments of confusion that aren't yet resolved and inhabit them. And so that's kind of my way of neither saying yay nor nay about abolitionism. I hope, to borrow a line from my favorite play, this is Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons, in the moment when Thomas More says to his rather dullard best friend, from whom he's trying to evade having expressed any moral convictions whatsoever, Thomas More asks, "I trust I make myself obscure."
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful way to end what is clearly a very complicated topic. So I think we can take forward the idea of the spirit of abolition, something to start a conversation with about better ideas to think about our current criminal justice system. Thank you so much to both our speakers today, Professor Koehler, Professor Lacey. You've been wonderful, and thank you so much to your audience for coming here and listening to our speakers today. I hope we see you in our future events as well. So that brings us to the end of our event, and have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been terrific. Thank you. Have a lovely weekend.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.